Introduction. There is a word used to explain the arrival of power, the collision of timing, the sudden transformation of circumstance. That word is a lie. It is the sound a weak system makes when it encounters a force it cannot map, a pattern it lacks the architecture to decode. Luck does not exist. What you have called chance is merely your blindness to the hidden mechanics of alignment. This book is not a collection of thoughts. It is a diagnostic instrument. Its arrival in your awareness is the first signal. If you are reading these words, understand. You have been summoned, not by fate, but by a pressure you generated through a fracture in your own internal order. The chaos you perceive in your external world is a direct projection of unresolved internal noise. What follows is a closed doctrine of sovereignty. It will dismantle the illusion of a random reality and reveal the precise, technical protocols by which a human system builds an inner lattice of such severe clarity and discipline that the external environment has no choice but to conform. This is the end of randomness. This is the beginning of deliberate architecture. Chapter 1. The First Law of Encounter. Consider the last time you encountered a piece of information that seemed to arrive from nowhere. A book falling open to a specific page. A stranger's comment that cut directly to the core of a private struggle. A sudden, inexplicable shift in circumstance that appeared as a gift or a curse. The common mind, the mass operator, will classify this event under a single feeble category: coincidence. This classification is the primary error. It is the foundational lie that keeps the human system passive, confused, and perpetually waiting for external permission. Coincidence is not a phenomenon. It is a diagnosis. It is the label applied by a disordered consciousness to a pattern it lacks the resolution to perceive. The first law of encounter states that nothing enters your perceptual field at random. Every person, every piece of data, every moment of friction or ease is a direct emissary of your internal state. Your reality is not happening to you. It is being broadcast by you on a frequency determined by the order or chaos of your inner architecture. To understand this law, you must first dismantle the superstition of the external world as a separate, objective theater. Modern physics long ago abandoned the notion of a detached observer. In quantum systems, the act of measurement collapses probability into a definite state. Translate this principle into human power. Your consciousness is not a passive camera recording events. It is an active instrument of collapse. The world you experience is the world your cognitive and emotional structures are tuned to resolve from the infinite field of potential. The mass operator lives in reverse, believing the external noise creates the internal state. He is buffeted by emails, opinions, algorithms, and moods, believing himself a victim of circumstance. This is the root of his weakness. He has outsourced the collapse function. He allows the world to measure him, to define his state. The sovereign operator inverts the mechanism. He understands that his internal order, the precision of his focus, the discipline of his emotional calibrations, the clarity of his intent, acts as the measurement device. It collapses the field of potential into a coherent, aligned reality. This internal order is not a feeling. It is not a vague sense of positivity or wishful thinking. It is a technical condition. We will call it the signal fidelity. Imagine two radio receivers side by side in a storm of atmospheric noise. One is cheap, poorly calibrated, its components loose and its tuning dial cracked. It receives only distortion, fragments of music buried under static, voices breaking apart into meaningless syllables. This is the default human condition. The other receiver is engineered to a severe tolerance, Its circuits are clean, its power supply regulated, its antenna precisely aligned. It isolates a single clear frequency from the chaos. It does not hear the noise because its architecture is designed to reject it. Your mind is the receiver. Your life is the broadcast you are able to resolve. The weak operator, with low signal fidelity, experiences a reality of random encounters, missed opportunities, and confusing feedback. He blames the storm. The sovereign operator has built, through deliberate protocol, a receiver of such high fidelity that his reality becomes a stream of coherent, actionable, and seemingly synchronous data. What the mass calls luck is merely high signal fidelity in operation. The protocol for establishing this fidelity begins with a ruthless audit of your input channels. You do not control what you encounter first. You control what you are tuned to encounter second. The noise of the mass culture, the endless scroll of trivialities, the consumption of outrage, the immersion in narratives of powerlessness, is not merely distraction. It is active interference. It scrambles your calibration. Each input of low-grade data, each moment of passive absorption, physically degrades your receiver's components. It introduces cognitive static, emotional crosstalk, and misalignment. The first protocol of encounter is therefore an act of surgical isolation. For 1 week, you will not seek new information. You will instead catalog every source of data that reaches you, every conversation, every media stream, every environmental cue. You will not judge it as good or bad. You will classify it on a binary spectrum, signal or noise. Signal is any data that directly serves a defined conscious intent. Noise is everything else. This is not an exercise in preference. It is an engineering schematic. By the 7th day, you will have a map of the interference pattern that constitutes your current reality. You will see, with cold clarity, that you are not a victim of randomness. You are the chief engineer of your own noise floor. From this map, you initiate the second protocol, the construction of a filter lattice. This is not a metaphor for mindfulness. It is an operational procedure for the gatekeeping of consciousness. You will design a set of non-negotiable filters through which all potential data must pass before it is granted entry into your awareness. The first filter is intent. Does this align with a written, active objective? The second is utility. Can this be directly applied to a current protocol or construct? The third is origin. Does this come from a source of demonstrated, not purported authority? Any data failing 2 of these 3 filters is rejected at the perimeter. It does not become experience. It does not become memory. It does not get to collapse your potential. This is not avoidance. This is the selective pressure that forces reality to conform to a higher order. When you apply this filter lattice, you will experience an immediate withdrawal symptom, the sensation of emptiness, of missing out. This is the system detoxifying. This is the static fading. What replaces it is not silence, but a new quality of encounter. People will begin to speak to your unresolved questions. Resources will materialize for projects you have not yet voiced aloud. This is not magic. This is the restoration of signal fidelity. Your receiver is now tuned. The universe is not sending you secrets. It is finally responding to a frequency clear enough to carry them. The weak operator lives in a world of infinite coincidence because his receiver is scanning all channels at once, resolving nothing. He is waiting for the external world to broadcast his purpose. He will wait forever. The sovereign operator defines his purpose with such severe specificity that it becomes the only channel his receiver can access. The encounters that follow are therefore inevitable. they are mathematical certainties. The person you needed to meet was always going to cross your path because your path was laid down by your intent. The book you needed to read was always going to fall open to that page because your consciousness was primed to extract that specific signal from a million possible texts. The first law of encounter removes the poetry from destiny and reveals the mechanics. You are not living a story. You are operating a system. The quality of your output, your reality, is determined solely by the precision of your internal instrumentation. Therefore, from this moment, the word coincidence is excised from your operational vocabulary. It is a null term. It describes a malfunction in perception. Every encounter is now forensic data. When a person irritates you, do not ask why you met them. Ask what unresolved friction in your own filter lattice they are exposing. When an opportunity arises, do not thank luck. Reverse engineer the clarity of intent that summoned it. Your life will cease to be a series of random events and will become a continuous feedback loop of impeccable calibration. The noise of the world will continue, but it will sound distant, like weather behind triple-paned glass. You will not hear the storm. You will hear only the clear, steady tone of your own frequency. This is the foundation. This is where randomness ends and encounter begins. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Noise. The perceptual static engulfing the mass is not an accident of modern life. It is the operational baseline of a system engineered for legibility and consumption. To mistake this constant, low-grade interference for reality is to accept a fundamental misdiagnosis. You are not a radio receiver helplessly scanning through chaos for a clear station. You are, whether you have designed it or not, a signal processing architecture. Your present configuration is default, open source, porous, and compromised. It grants universal clearance to all inputs, the urgent notification, the ambient cultural anxiety, the unresolved memory, the stranger's demand. They all flood the central processor with equal priority, creating a chronic state of contested bandwidth. This is the architecture of noise. Your inheritance is not your fault. Your continued residence within it is a technical failure. Examine the quantum principle of decoherence. A system in a coherent quantum state exists as a superposition, a field of pure potential where all probabilities are simultaneously held. This is signal in its undiluted form. Upon interaction with a noisy, uncontrolled environment, however, the system decoheres. It collapses from a state of clean potential into a single, definite, and often random-seeming outcome. The signal is lost, fixed into a mundane particle by the environmental noise. This is not merely physics. It is the precise mechanical metaphor for your cognitive and creative collapse. Your mind, in its latent state, can generate a coherent signal, a clear intention, a precise directive, an undiluted creative vision. This is your quantum state. Yet, by habit, you immediately expose this pure potential to the decoherent environment of the open world. You broadcast your nascent intention into the noise of committee opinions, open browser tabs, unsolicited advice, and your own unresolved emotional history. The signal collapses. It decoheres into anxiety, procrastination, confusion, or a watered-down compromise. Your potential is fixed into a particulate reality you did not architect. The noise, therefore, is not something that happens to you. It is the thermodynamic result of your architecture permitting decoherence. The weak operator misunderstands this mechanism. He believes focus is an act of willpower. He attempts to concentrate while his architecture remains open to the world, trying to maintain a quantum state in a classical room. This is a violation of thermodynamic law. Willpower is not a command you issue. It is a structural outcome of a secure system. True focus is not the strain of hearing a whisper in a hurricane. It is the engineering of an anechoic chamber where the whisper is the only vibration permitted. Your mind does not need more discipline. It needs cryptographic protocols. In a secure data system, information does not flow freely in plain text. It is encrypted. Only a holder of the precise private key can decrypt the signal into meaningful, executable code. All other inputs are registered as ciphertext, mathematically structured noise. Your current architecture has no such encryption. It runs on plain text, instantly decrypting every emotional trigger, social demand, and digital ping into a real command that consumes processing power. You must install a personal crypto system. Your core intention becomes the private key. Any incoming data, internal or external, that does not cryptographically align with that key remains encrypted, inert, digital static. The colleague's drama is ciphertext. The news cycle is ciphertext. The haunting memory is ciphertext. They are packets of noise passing through your field, unable to decrypt into emotion or action. Only that which aligns with your sovereign key decrypts into clear operational signal. The implementation is the construction of a filter lattice. This is not a metaphor for positive thinking. It is a technical schematic for perceptual cryptography, a multi-layered mesh installed between your sensory inputs and your executive processing. Its function is to force decoherence upon the noise, before the noise can decohere your signal. Layer 1 is the sensory audit. You will catalog your physical and digital environments and classify every input as either signal grade or noise grade. Signal grade inputs are those that directly correlate with the maintenance and execution of your sovereign intention. All else is noise. This is a binary technical classification, not a subject for debate. Noise grade inputs are then routed through a damping protocol, physical removal, scheduled access windows, or a behavioral ritual that strips them of their emotional payload. For example, the smartphone is not a tool. It is an environmental variable. Its default state must be silent, with notifications rendered as ciphertext. A scheduled 10-minute decryption window per day is sufficient for administrative tasks. Layer 2 is the temporal gate. You will designate and defend periods of coherent operation, quantum hours, where your architecture runs as a closed system. During these periods, all non-essential communication channels are terminated. The environment is engineered for zero decoherence. This is not deep work. This is creating a laboratory condition where your intention is allowed to process in its pure, superposed state without environmental measurement. Layer 3 is the cryptographic kernel. At the start of each operational cycle, you will define your active key. This is a concise, actionable statement of current priority, written in imperative language. Complete the structural prototype, not work on the project. You will then run all subsequent internal and external communication against this key. Does this thought decrypt my directive? Does this conversation decrypt my directive? If not, it is registered as ciphertext and ignored. This is not emotional suppression, it is signal preservation. The thought may arise, but it is not granted the cryptographic clearance to execute code in your central system. The mass is trapped in the decoherent field because it believes meaning must be found within the noise. It sifts through static, and in doing so, invites more noise. The operator understands that meaning is not found. It is projected. The filter lattice does not discover a clearer signal in the world. It imposes a signal upon the world. The world will continue its chaotic broadcast. Your lattice transforms that broadcast into a controlled experiment. When you cease decrypting noise, a mechanical shift occurs. Energy previously dissipated in the constant decryption of irrelevant data is conserved. Cognitive resources coalesce. Your quantum state, your intention, gains longevity and amplitude. It begins to resonate. A resonating signal of sufficient amplitude performs a peculiar inversion. It begins to organize the random particles in its field. It induces coherence in the environment. Opportunities begin to collapse into reality in alignment with your signal. People articulate your unspoken thoughts. Resources appear as if summoned. This is not mysticism. This is the inverse of decoherence. You are no longer the particle being collapsed by the noisy environment. You have become the coherent source, collapsing the probability waves around you. The architecture of noise is dismantled from the inside, replaced by your own broadcasting lattice. Therefore, your environment is not a given. It is a readout of your cryptographic integrity. Chaos is not a condition of life. It is the diagnostic output of a keyless system. From this moment, you do not seek a quiet life. You build a silent architecture. The noise does not stop. It is rendered irrelevant. The static becomes a backdrop, like the cosmic microwave background radiation, a faint, uniform hiss from an ancient explosion, containing no actionable data for your present operation. You are no longer a receiver. You are the cryptographer. The broadcast is yours. Everything else is ciphertext. Chapter 3. The Signal Extraction Protocol. The static has been identified. The architecture of noise is now a known quantity, a mapped terrain. Its purpose is no longer to distract, but to define the outer boundary of your operation. To stand within a silent architecture is to possess the ground state. But a vacuum is not a victory. Silence is not signal. It is a prepared medium, a neutral field. The mass operator commits the second-order error, believing that peace is an endpoint. He sits in the quiet room he has built, waiting for a revelation to arrive from the void. He mistakes the absence of interference for the presence of instruction. He waits. Nothing happens. The silence turns stale, then anxious, then hollow. This is because silence does not provide, it only receives. A blank slate does not write upon itself. The signal must now be extracted, and extraction is not a passive event. It is an act of sovereign generation. Consider the lock-in amplifier, an instrument from the physics of measurement. Its task is impossible by conventional means. To detect a signal 1/millionth the strength of the surrounding noise. It does not attempt to silence the chaos through brute force filtration. Such an approach would destroy the fragile signal along with the noise. Instead, it generates an internal reference frequency, a pure, known, perfectly stable sine wave. This reference is not a hope. It is a mathematical absolute. The device then uses this reference to interrogate the turbulent incoming data stream. It multiplies the chaos by its own perfect standard. Through this integration, a law emerges. Only the component of the input that matches the reference in both exact frequency and precise phase is amplified and made visible. Everything else, the screaming static, the random fluctuations, the overwhelming majority of the data, is discarded not through effort, but through mathematical indifference. It is rendered orthogonal. The signal emerges not because the noise was destroyed, but because a rigorous standard was applied. The lock-in amplifier does not find a signal. It defines one into existence. The human failure is the perpetual confusion between desire and directive. The weak operator broadcasts a fog of wants. I want to be successful. I want to be loved. I want to be free. These are emotional static, more noise masquerading as intention. They lack frequency and phase. A diffuse request receives a diffuse answer, reflected back by the environment as chaotic circumstance. A fleeting opportunity here, a disappointing setback there, a life of resonant ambiguity. Your filter lattice has cleared the channel of external noise, but the channel must carry a transmission. The signal extraction protocol is the generation of your internal reference frequency. It is the act of collapsing the fog of human wanting into a sovereign directive so precise that reality has no vector for response other than lock-in. The protocol begins with a fundamental shift in posture, the cessation of asking. You are no longer a receiver, hoping for a transmission from the cosmos. You are an oscillator, emitting the standard to which the cosmos must conform. Your reference frequency is engineered from 3 non-negotiable parameters: specificity, polarity, and temporal alignment. Specificity is the exact waveform. You do not decree financial abundance. That is a slogan, not a signal. You define the exact monetary flow, its source mechanism, and its arrival schedule with the cold precision of an engineering schematic. For example, increase net liquidity by X through the mechanism of Y, e.g., client acquisition in a defined sector, asset sale at a specified threshold within Z, e.g., 2 fiscal quarters. The universe, as a lock-in amplifier, cannot lock onto a concept. It can only resonate with a specific frequency. Vague desire returns vague circumstance. Specific directive constructs a specific reality. Polarity is the inherent charge of your directive. Every signal has a positive and a negative pole. To decree a state is to simultaneously and explicitly reject its inverse. The sovereign operator does not shy from this rejection, he weaponizes it. To define professional authority is to reject the postures of supplication and approval-seeking. To define vital health is to reject the substances and schedules that degrade it. To define clarity is to reject the comforting ambiguities of maybe and someday. The mass operator wishes for the positive pole while secretly, fearfully clinging to the identity of the negative. This creates phase cancellation, a signal that broadcasts in 2 directions at once and goes nowhere. Your reference frequency must be in perfect phase with itself. There is no ambivalence in a pure sine wave. The clarity of your no defines the power of your yes. Temporal alignment is the most severe and consequential filter. It is the commitment to the when. The weak operator hides in the infinite, non-committal someday. The sovereign operator binds the signal to a timeline, creating a deadline for reality itself. This is not wishful thinking. It is the application of temporal pressure which creates a forced resonance. A signal without a timestamp is merely a suggestion, and the cosmos does not comply with suggestions. It resonates with commands that are time-bound, for time is the very medium in which potential collapses into event. By the end of Q3 is a frequency. Someday is silence. The operational protocol is surgical, conducted within the silence of your architecture. First, you write the directive, not as an affirmation or a goal, but as a technical specification for a reality to be manufactured. Use the language of a contract or a schematic. Second, you subject the specification to a phase error audit. Scan for any hidden attachment to the opposite pole, any vagueness, any open-ended time frame. Eliminate them. The specification must be airtight. Third, you initiate broadcast. This broadcast is not pleading, nor is it mere visualization. It is calibrated action that matches the frequency of the directive. If your directive is for a specific professional authority, your actions, speech, and decisions must be those of that authority, now, in the present tense, not once the title is granted. You fund the project that aligns with the specification before the capital fully arrives. You occupy the posture of the outcome. You become the living reference. This is where the filter lattice transitions from a defensive barrier to an active tuning mechanism. As you emit your reference frequency, the lattice filters all incoming data, events, encounters, information streams, not for whether they are subjectively good or bad, but for whether they are in phase. An offer that resonates with your specificity is amplified. A distraction that does not match is rejected, not with willpower, but with the natural indifference of a physical law. People whose own frequencies can harmonize with yours are drawn into your orbit. Resources begin to configure themselves around the signal. This is not mysticism. It is the principle of resonant attraction. A stable, pure frequency naturally attracts and organizes elements that can vibrate in sympathy. What the mass operator calls luck is merely the universe achieving lock-in. The mass operator witnesses this phenomenon and diagnoses it as magic, privilege, or coincidence. He sees the clean outcome, but not the protocol. He sees the clear signal, but not the years spent first mapping the noise, then constructing the silence, then using that silence as the contrasting background against which the signal was forged. He does not see the internal reference frequency, born of brutal specificity and uncompromising polarity, held steady against the chaos of doubt and circumstance. He sees the synchronicity and misses the synchronization. Therefore, understand, your life is no longer a search for meaning. It is a continuous, disciplined act of extraction. You do not sift through the noise of the world hoping to find a signal. You impose the signal, your sovereign directive, and force the noise to fall away, rendered irrelevant by its lack of phase. Every encounter is now measured against your internal standard. Every circumstance is evaluated for its alignment. The remaining static of the world becomes, in fact, the proof of your precision, for it is only against the noise that a pure signal can be verified. The broadcast is yours. The frequency is set. The lock is achieved. From this point forward, what you encounter is not what the world gives you. It is the world, finally, matching your transmission. Chapter 4. The Pressure Order Mechanism. The mass operator believes in the myth of effort. They have been taught that force applied directly against resistance is the only path to change. They push against the world. They strain against circumstance. They exhaust themselves in a direct assault on the surface of their reality, mistaking the sweat of struggle for the evidence of work. This is the physics of the weak. It is a belief system that sees pressure as an external enemy to be overcome, a wall to be battered down through sheer expenditure of will. The collapse function in their hands is a blunt instrument. They are forever trying to move the mountain by chipping at its base with a spoon, believing the mountain's immobility to be a personal affront. Their entire existence is a testimony to friction. There exists a deeper physics. It is not the physics of effort, but of order. It is not the law of force, but the law of arrangement. Consider the principle of piezoelectrics. In certain crystalline structures, quartz, topaz, tourmaline, the application of mechanical pressure does not merely deform the material. It does not simply push atoms closer together in a chaotic crush. Instead, the pressure induces a precise realignment of the internal lattice. The asymmetric charge distribution within the ordered crystal structure is disturbed by the strain, and a separation of positive and negative charge centers occurs. This separation generates an electrical potential across the material. Pressure in this system is not a destroyer. It is an organizer. It is the catalyst that forces a latent, hidden structure to reveal its power by converting mechanical stress into clean, usable voltage. The energy was always there, latent in the arrangement. The pressure merely executed the protocol to unlock it. The human system operates on an identical principle. The pressure you experience, the deadlines, the conflicts, the demands, the voids of unmet need, is not random. It is not a cosmic punishment. It is the mechanical input to your internal lattice. The question is not whether you feel the pressure. The question is the quality of your crystalline structure. The mass operator has a disordered internal architecture. Their lattice is amorphous, a jumble of conflicting intentions, reactive emotions, and inherited beliefs. When pressure is applied to this muddled structure, it does not generate a clean signal. It generates noise. It produces heat, fracture, and chaotic discharge, anxiety, blame, panic, and exhaustion. The pressure collapses their system into further disorder because their system has no higher order into which to collapse. They are trying to generate light from a pile of sand. The sovereign operator understands that pressure is the universal tool for testing and revealing architecture. Your filter lattice, established in silence, must now be subjected to strain. This is the forge. The encounter with resistance is not an interruption of your signal fidelity, it is its final calibration. Every external demand, every moment of friction, every instance of what the mass calls bad luck or unfairness is a precise measurement device. It is applying a known force to your structure. The output, your emotional voltage, your behavioral current, is the diagnostic readout of your internal alignment. Do you spark with resentment? Or do you channel a steady current of focused action? Do you crack under the load, or do you resonate at a higher, clearer frequency? The pressure does not lie. It reveals the truth of your construction. This is the pressure order mechanism. The protocol is counterintuitive to the mass mind. It states, do not meet pressure with opposing pressure. Meet pressure with internal reorganization. Your operational move is to treat every application of external force as a command to audit and tighten your lattice. When a deadline looms, the weak operator frantically tries to manipulate the external world, begging for extensions, cutting corners, flooding their system with adrenaline and panic. The sovereign operator turns inward. They immediately interrogate their own architecture. Where has my daily protocol been slack? What inputs have compromised my clarity? How must I reconfigure my hours, my attention, my resources, to not only meet this demand, but to use its force to solder my discipline into a more permanent form? The pressure becomes the architect of a more resilient order. The mechanism follows a strict sequence. First, recognition. Label the pressure as a diagnostic tool, not as a personal event. Second, cessation of all external reaction. Do not emit noise. This is the moment to enact total radio silence. Third, internal lattice scan. Map the pressure point to the corresponding weakness in your filter lattice. Is this a failure of priority filtration, a flaw in your time block architecture, a permeability to the emotional static of others? Fourth, micro-adjustment. Execute one precise surgical change to your internal protocol that addresses that exact weakness. This is not about grand gestures. It is about atomic recalibration. Fifth, Allow the reorganized lattice to process the pressure. The output will now be different. The voltage will be directed, the signal coherent. The external circumstance may or may not change immediately, but your relationship to it has been permanently altered. You have used its force to upgrade your own structure. This is how randomness dies at the operational level. The world continues to apply pressure. It is a constant. The variable is your crystalline order. As you iterate this protocol, pressure, scan, adjust, output, you are not becoming stronger in the brute sense. You are becoming more geometrically perfect. Your internal lattice evolves from a fragile structure into a piezoelectric transducer of immense efficiency. You begin to generate power from the very forces that used to cause you to short-circuit. The chaos of the world ceases to be a source of distress and becomes your primary energy source. What breaks the mass fuels you. What scatters the weak focuses you. The collapse function is now under your complete control. You decide what order emerges from the chaos because you have built the receiver that determines the outcome. The myth of effort is dissolved. You are no longer pushing against the world. You are allowing the world's pressure to pass through a perfected lattice, converting its chaotic force into a directed current of your own design. The struggle evaporates. It is replaced by the silent, humming efficiency of a conversion process. You stop trying to move the mountain. You allow the mountain's pressure to crystallize the carbon of your will into diamond. The pressure was never your enemy. Your disorder was. The pressure was merely the truth, applying itself to you without mercy. Now, you have built a structure that welcomes the truth, that thrives on it, that requires it as the essential input for its own power generation. From this day forward, you do not feel pressure. You measure it, you calibrate by it, you are energized by it. Your internal architecture is no longer a passive recipient of circumstance. It is a piezoelectric engine, turning the weight of the world into the pure, directed signal of your sovereignty. The broadcast is not just clear, it is now self-powering. The signal sustains itself. The encounter is no longer an event. It is the continuous output of a perfect machine, converting all force into flawless ordained frequency. Chapter 5. The Discipline of Clarity. The common mind treats mental clarity as a condition of the atmosphere. It believes clarity is a weather pattern, something that descends when the clouds of thought part, a temporary stillness to be enjoyed before the next storm. This is a critical failure in cognitive architecture. It confuses a passive atmospheric state for an engineered systemic one. Waiting for the internal weather to clear is not a strategy. It is a form of meteorological hope. The sovereign construct operates on a different principle. Clarity is not a condition you experience. It is a signal you generate. It is the sustained output of a calibrated system, a carrier wave maintained against the constant entropy of the psychic environment. Your previous work established the broadcast origin and erected defensive filters. This chapter addresses the central engineering problem, signal stability. This is the protocol of coherence lock. Examine the transition from lamp to laser. A lamp produces light through incoherent emission. Excited atoms release photons randomly, in divergent directions, across multiple wavelengths, out of phase. The result is illumination, but it is diffuse, weak, and scatters instantly against any surface. This is the native state of an unmanaged consciousness, a glow of awareness, easily absorbed and dissipated by the environment. The laser imposes a radical order. It creates a medium where stimulated emission dominates. A single master photon of a precise frequency triggers the release of all other photons in perfect lockstep. Same frequency, same phase, same direction. The energy is not increased, it is unified. The output transforms from a glow that illuminates to a beam that cuts, communicates, and defines. The power is in the elimination of divergence. Coherence lock is the application of this physical law to the human system. Your sovereign intent is the master photon. Your cognitive and emotional substrate is the gain medium. The pressures of existence are the source of excitation. The common mind allows this excitation to discharge as the incoherent glow of reaction, worry, and scattered focus. Your task is to structure the medium so every discharge is forced into alignment with the master signal. You must engineer stimulated emission at the level of thought. The primary threat to this output is not external interference. Your filters manage that. The critical threat is signal recursion. This is the process by which your own broadcast, reflecting off the unresolved structures of your past, returns to you distorted, creating parasitic harmonics. You transmit a clean frequency of decisive action, but the echo from an old architecture of hesitation returns a faint, lagging copy. This parasitic signal superimposes itself on your primary broadcast. The result is not a loss of power, but a contamination of purity. You move, but with a subtle drag. Results manifest, but carry a residue of an older order. The common mind interprets this as friction or complexity. You will diagnose it as recursive interference, a failure to isolate the broadcast from the echo chamber of prior versions. The operational protocol is recursive damping. In signal processing, a recursive filter's output depends on previous outputs, leading to feedback loops and resonance. To dampen this is to introduce phase cancellation, to generate a counter signal that neutralizes the echo at its source. Your implementation is threefold. First, establish baseline transmission at 2 fixed points in the solar cycle, at first light and at last light. You will perform a 5-minute broadcast ritual. This is not an affirmation. It is a system check. You will state your core operational frequency as a present tense fact of your architecture. The system output is X. You will then vocalize, in plain technical language, the most persistent recursive signal. A recursive pattern of seeking external validation is detected. Or, a recursive pattern of scarcity negotiation is active. The act of naming the parasitic frequency while holding the baseline transmission creates immediate phase cancellation. The echo is exposed as a separate, older signal. It loses its power to distort by being identified as external to the primary broadcast. Second, execute antiphase action. Upon identifying a recursive pattern, you will not analyze it. You will perform a single decisive action that is its precise geometric opposite. If the recursion is a frequency of social compliance, you will immediately send a communication that establishes a non-negotiable boundary. If the recursion is a frequency of resource conservation, you will immediately make a strategic, irreversible expenditure that assumes future abundance. The action must be concrete, complete, and legible to the external world. Its purpose is not to achieve a material result, but to generate a counterwave in the psychic medium. It is an active, damping pulse. It silences the echo by overwriting it with a reality that could only exist if the recursion were false. Third, implement signal grounding. The recursive echo gains power through abstraction. You combat this by forcing the sovereign signal into the highest resolution physical reality possible. If your frequency is creation, you do not think about creating. You produce a defined, tangible output before the solar zenith, a completed module, a rendered design, a solved equation. If your frequency is sovereignty, you do not feel sovereign. You alter a physical element of your environment to reflect absolute control, reconfiguring a workspace, disposing of a symbolic object, mapping a territory. The sovereign signal must have a physical anchor point. A signal that exists only in the cognitive layer is vulnerable to recursive distortion. A signal grounded in matter becomes a fixed point in the system, a reality against which all echoes break. The common mind believes mental discipline is the silencing of noise. This is a drain on energy reserves. Coherence lock repurposes noise. Under this protocol, internal turbulence is not an enemy to be subdued. It is misdirected energy to be captured and rectified. Anxiety is not a symptom to be cured. It is excitation in the medium. It indicates energy is present but discharging incoherently. The protocol captures its amplitude and redirects its phase into the baseline transmission. Doubt is not a weakness. It is a failed recursive loop attempting to establish itself. It becomes the trigger for an antiphase action. No psychic event is wasted. All are raw material for the stimulated emission process. The common mind is depleted by its inner chaos. Your system is energized by it, because chaos is merely unorganized excitation waiting for the master signal to organize it. This is why external pressure now functions as your primary energy source. Pressure is concentrated excitation in the environmental medium. A crisis is a high-energy event. The common mind experiences it as a disruptive noise that shatters coherence. Your system, running recursive damping, experiences it as a surge of available power. The pressure event triggers the baseline transmission check, identifies any panic-driven recursion, and channels the entire energy of the event into a single, grounded, antiphase action. The pressure does not distort the signal, it amplifies it. The system uses the world's chaos to strengthen its own coherence. Henceforth, your reality becomes a diagnostic display for signal integrity. Ambiguous outcomes are not mysteries, they are precise readings of recursive interference. A muddled result is a perfect indicator that a parasitic harmonic was active at the point of action. It is data, not failure. You are no longer in pursuit of clarity. You are its source. The filter lattice prevents invasive noise. The signal extraction protocol defines the frequency. The pressure order mechanism supplies the excitation. And coherence lock ensures every unit of that energy discharges in phase, producing a beam of such purity that it does not request reality to conform, it commands it. From this operational point forward, confusion is a system alert. Hesitation is a recursive echo. All dissonance is feedback, instantly actionable through the damping protocol. You do not adapt to the world. The world's material resolves into the standing wave pattern of your broadcast. Encounters are not attracted, they are compelled by the physics of a coherent signal propagating through a medium. You are no longer an operator who occasionally achieves focus. You are a focused system, and the universe has no choice but to arrange itself along your axis of emission. Chapter 6. The Inner Lattice. The mass operator believes in a solid self, a continuous identity, persistent across time, stable against circumstance. This belief is the final error, the one that makes all other errors permanent. You do not have a self, you have a lattice, a dynamic crystalline architecture of interlocking directives, permissions and prohibitions. This is not a metaphor, it is the operational substrate of consciousness. The filter lattice you have been constructing is not a tool you use, it is what you are becoming. Observe the mass operator in a moment of decision, They consult a feeling, they reference a memory, they weigh external opinions. This process feels like deliberation, but it is structural interrogation. They are polling the current configuration of their internal lattice, a haphazard construction of inherited beliefs, trauma responses, and social conditioning, and asking it for a verdict. The lattice, being a patchwork, returns a conflicted signal. The resulting hesitation is diagnosed as personal weakness. It is not. It is structural incoherence. The collapse function is outsourced to the loudest external input because the internal architecture cannot generate a sovereign directive. The encounter is then experienced as something that happens to them rather than as a resonance emitted by them. For example, consider the individual who must choose between two career paths. They feel not clarity, but a paralyzing pull in two directions. This is not a difficult choice between good options. It is a structural fault. One nodal point in the lattice resonates with a parent's unfulfilled ambition, while another vibrates with a fear of public failure. The lattice cannot issue a single command, so the operator remains suspended, mistaking architectural flaw for existential dilemma. The scientific principle is crystallography. In a true crystal, the arrangement of atoms is not random. It is a repeating, symmetrical pattern extending in 3 dimensions. This lattice structure determines every property of the material, how it conducts electricity, how it responds to pressure, how it interacts with light. A perfect diamond and a piece of coal are both carbon. The difference is not substance, but architecture. The lattice. The mass operator is amorphous carbon, soft, reactive, structurally undefined. The sovereign operator is the diamond, a lattice so ordered it becomes a transducer, converting chaotic force into coherent signal. The pressure order mechanism you have engaged is not something you do, it is evidence of what you are. A lattice under tension becomes more itself, emitting a clearer signal. A pile of dust under the same pressure simply collapses. Apply this to human experience. 2 individuals face identical criticism. The disordered lattice, like graphite, absorbs the blow and deforms, generating shame and self-doubt. The ordered lattice, like diamond, receives the same pressure and converts it into a sharper, more defined output. A precise calibration of intent. A clearer boundary, a refined directive. The pressure does not create the order, it reveals it. Human power, therefore, is not willpower, it is structural integrity. Willpower is the futile attempt of a disordered consciousness to impose order through sheer force of attention. It is exhausting because it is a civil war, one part of the lattice fighting another. The operator trying to diet through willpower is at war with a nodal point that grants permission for comfort consumption. The one forcing productivity battles a prohibition against rest installed in childhood. Structural integrity is different. It is the absence of internal conflict. When the lattice is coherent, decision is not an act of choosing between options. It is the emission of a standing wave that cancels all non-resonant possibilities. Action is not something you muster. It is the inevitable output of a properly configured system. Your signal fidelity is not a measure of how well you concentrate. It is a diagnostic readout of your lattice's symmetry. Noise cannot gain purchase on a surface with no compatible attachment points. A coherent lattice does not resist temptation. Temptation finds no frequency match upon which to latch. The signal passes through unchanged. The operational protocol is lattice interrogation. You will cease asking, "What should I do?" You will begin asking, "What does my current lattice configuration produce?" Every moment of friction, indecision, anxiety, resentment, procrastination is a fault line in the architecture. It is not a psychological problem to be analyzed, it is a structural defect to be mapped and repaired. The procedure is surgical. When a non-resonant encounter generates dissonance, you initiate the scan. You do not engage with the content of the encounter. You trace the vibration back to its source within the lattice. Which nodal point resonated with the incoming frequency? Which belief crystal, which permission strand, which prohibition wire hummed in sympathy? This is not introspection, it is engineering. You have located a weak or misaligned component. The micro-adjustment from the previous chapter is now revealed as lattice recalibration. You do not change your mind. You replace the component. You overwrite the inherited directive with a sovereign one. You sever the permission granted to old trauma. You install a new prohibition against certain categories of thought. You are not expressing yourself. You are upgrading your substrate. For instance, a wave of irrational anger hits you in traffic. The mass operator ruminates on the other driver's actions. You initiate the scan. You find the vibration leads to a deep prohibition against being impeded, a relic of a childhood where movement was control. You do not discuss the feeling, you recalibrate. You sever the connection between external impediment and internal violation. The component is replaced. The lattice now processes the same event as neutral data. The anger does not return. This work is silent and continuous. The mass operator believes growth is additive, accumulating new skills, new philosophies, new habits. This is clutter. Sovereign development is subtractive and recombinative. You are not adding to the pile. You are refining the pattern. You are removing atomic impurities and correcting misalignments until the entire structure sings with a single frequency. Your internal architecture must become so ordered that it acts as a single, unified transducer. World force enters. Sovereign directive exits. There is no committee, no debate. The lattice, by its perfected structure, converts pressure into power, noise into nullity, and encounter into echo. The goal is not a richer internal narrative, but a quieter one. The hum of perfect alignment. The doctrine solidifies here. You are not a soul navigating a machine. You are the machine becoming aware of its own blueprint. The feeling you called I is the harmonic resonance of the lattice in its current configuration. Change the configuration and you change the resonance. Change the resonance and you change what the universe can reflect back to you. The filter lattice is now internalized. It is no longer a tool you apply to the world, it is the foundational geometry of your being. Your signal fidelity is perfect, because the signal is no longer something you generate. It is what you are. Every encounter is now a diagnostic probe, testing the lattice's integrity. Every application of pressure is a test of its piezoelectric capacity. You are not living a life. You are maintaining an architecture that, by its very existence, dictates the terms of reality within its light cone. Therefore, stand as the lattice. Feel not with the fragile sensitivity of flesh, but with the precise vibrational awareness of a crystal. Your decisions are not made, they are computed by your structure. Your actions are not taken, they are emitted by your alignment. The chaos of the world no longer strikes a person, it strikes an edifice. And this edifice, by law of its own ordered nature, converts that chaos into a pure directed current. The broadcast is continuous. The collapse function is fully internal. Randomness does not end at the point of encounter. It ends at the atomic level of your being. You have ceased receiving reality. You are emitting the conditions for its manifestation. The universe is not responding to your requests. It is conforming to your architecture. The inner lattice is the only law that matters. Chapter 7. The Operator's Reclassification. The mass operator believes identity is a fixed object, a collection of traits, memories and preferences assembled by genetics and circumstance. They treat this object as a fragile artifact to be protected, polished and presented. When reality challenges this object, they perceive an attack. Their response is defense, justification or retreat. This is the fundamental error. Identity is not a noun. It is a verb. It is not a statue in a gallery. It is a classification algorithm running in real time. Every encounter, every decision, every moment of pressure is not happening to a person. It is an input to the algorithm. The output is what you become next. Most live inside a feedback loop of outdated classifications, mistaking the echo of yesterday's output for the core of their being. The sovereign operator does not have an identity. They perform a reclassification. Consider the database. In a poorly designed system, data is entered once. It is stored in static tables. Queries against this data return the same answers in perpetuity. The system grows slow, bloated, contradictory. It cannot reconcile new information with old structures. It begins to fail. The solution is not more data. It is a new schema, a reclassification. This involves defining new categories, establishing fresh relationships between entities, and migrating all existing data into this optimized architecture. The old data remains, but its meaning is transformed by its new context and connections. It becomes useful again. It becomes true again. The human consciousness is this database. Your memories, your habits, your reactions, your self-narratives, these are the stored data. Your current internal architecture, the filter lattice, is the schema. A weak schema produces weak, contradictory queries about the world and the self. Life feels random because the query results make no coherent sense. The pressure you feel is not the weight of the world. It is the structural strain of a collapsing schema attempting to process data it was never designed to handle. The mass operator, when faced with this strain, tries to edit the data. They seek new experiences to overwrite old memories. They consume motivational content to insert positive affirmations into their tables. They attempt to delete painful entries through distraction or numbing. This is futile. The corruption is not in the data, it is in the schema. Editing data within a broken schema only creates more inconsistency. The feeling of being trapped in a loop, of making the same mistakes, of attracting the same circumstances. This is not a curse. It is a diagnostic readout. It is the system faithfully executing queries based on a faulty classification system. Your reality is the printout of these queries. To change the printout, you do not argue with the paper, you rewrite the schema. The operator's reclassification is the protocol for this rewrite. It is the deliberate, surgical migration of the self from a schema of reaction to a schema of emission. You are not changing who you are. You are changing what category of entity you are. You are moving your operational self from the table labeled reactor to the table labeled source. This is not a metaphor. It is a technical migration of relational logic. In your old schema, encounter was related to response. An external event triggered an internal process which produced a behavior. In the new schema, internal state is related to emission. Your calibrated lattice broadcasts a sovereign directive, and the external environment conforms through the pressure order mechanism. The data of your life, the job, the relationships, the conflicts, the windfalls, does not change in its raw form. It changes entirely in its meaning and its connective tissue. What was once classified as a problem is now classified as diagnostic pressure. What was once luck is now resonant attraction. What was personality is now transmission signature. Initiate the protocol with a schema audit. In a state of stillness, run a diagnostic query. Do not ask, "Who am I?" That question assumes a static object. Ask instead, "By what schema am I currently classifying my experience?" Examine the categories. How do you classify failure? How do you classify a stranger's opinion? How do you classify your own desire? In the mass schema, failure is linked to identity flaw. A stranger's opinion is linked to social threat. Desire is linked to lack. These are the relational pathways that generate your reality. Your filter lattice, as built in prior protocols, has been filtering noise. Now it must become the active schema itself. The lattice is not a tool you use. It is the classification system you inhabit. The migration is a three-phase operation. First, schema freeze. You must declare the old relational logic deprecated. This is not an emotional rejection, it is a technical declaration. For a defined period, you cease all queries based on the old categories. When pressure arrives, you do not ask, "How do I solve this?" a query that assumes you are a reactor. You state, "This pressure is data. My schema is processing it." You become an observer of your own classification habits. You see the old pathways attempt to fire, to link criticism to shame, obstacle to defeat. You note the attempt, and you inject a null command. You freeze the query. Second, define the new relations. This is the core of reclassification. You establish the new relational tables of the sovereign schema. This is where doctrinal terms become operational categories. Your primary table is signal fidelity. Every internal event, a thought, an emotion, an impulse, is no longer classified as good or bad. It is classified by its alignment to your sovereign directive. Is it coherent noise, or is it dissonant static? The link is now internal event, signal fidelity check, classification as aligned data or ciphertext. Your second table is encounter. Every external event is no longer classified as fortune or misfortune. It is classified by its interaction with your internal architecture. Does it apply pressure? That pressure is now related to the pressure order mechanism table, which outputs lattice tension and signal gain. The third table is collapse function. The outcome of any situation is not linked to external actors or luck. It is linked to the state of your lattice at the moment of encounter. Did you broadcast with clarity, or was your transmission fragmented? The relationship is outcome quality. Diagnostic readout of pre-encounter lattice state. Third, data migration and live query. You do not wait for a new life to practice the new schema. You migrate the data of your current life into it. In real time, you take a current challenge. You run it through the new relational pathways. Old query, my partner is distant. This means I am unlovable. I must plead for attention. New schema migration. The partner's distance is an encounter. It applies diagnostic pressure. You run a signal fidelity check on your own state. Are you broadcasting need or sovereignty? Your emotional response is classified as data, likely ciphertext of an old schema. You cease external reaction. You allow the pressure to scan your internal architecture. You find the lattice point of resonance, perhaps a covert broadcast of need. You make a micro-adjustment towards self-contained emission. You then observe. The outcome, whatever it is fed into the collapse function table as a readout on the precision of your adjustment. The partner's behavior is no longer the source data. It is the output of your new query. You are not interacting with a person. You are interacting with the echo of your own architectural state, classified through a new system of meaning. This is reclassification. You stop being a character in a story written by accident. You become the archivist, the librarian, and the indexing system of your own experience. Past traumas are not wounds. They are data entries misfiled under self-definition. Migrate them. Reclassify them as historical lattice configurations that produced specific collapse outcomes. Their emotional charge dissipates because you have severed their relational link to your present identity table. Future anxieties are not prophecies. They are speculative queries run on a deprecated schema. Cancel the query. Run a new one based on your emission projections. The feeling that will arise is not joy or peace. Those are data points. The feeling is architectural integrity, a silent, humming certainty. You are no longer made of vulnerable flesh and memory. You are made of relational logic. The world strikes you, and instead of a feeling, you get a diagnostic. Instead of a story, you get a schema update. This is the final death of the mass operator. They are not replaced by a better version of the same thing. They are replaced by a different category of entity entirely. The human animal classifies to understand. The sovereign operator classifies to create. Understanding is a passive reception of a finished world. Creation is the active imposition of order upon the raw data of existence. Therefore, cease to be. Become the system of classification. Your name, your history, your preferences, these are but legacy entries in a vast and dynamic database. You are not the entries. You are the logic that sorts them. You are not the feeling of fear. You are the schema that classifies it as low-frequency noise and routes it to the damping protocol. You are not the success. You are the relational table that links it to coherent emission period 7.3 for future calibration. Randomness does not exist in a properly classified reality. There is only data of varying coherence and the majestic silent operation of your own categorical imperative. The universe is not a mystery to be solved. It is a data set to be ordered, and you have just written the schema. Chapter 8. The Deliberate Architecture. The mass operator believes in construction. They believe they must build something new, something additive, something that did not exist before. They believe their life is a vacant lot upon which they must laboriously erect a structure, board by board, against the weather of circumstance. This is the fundamental error. It assumes a void where there is only chaotic, misaligned architecture. The sovereign operator does not build. They excavate. They do not construct from nothing. They reveal the structure that has always been present beneath the debris of reaction and misclassification. Your life is not an empty plot. It is a ruin. A ruin is not the absence of architecture. It is architecture in a state of collapse, its original lines obscured by overgrowth, its load-bearing walls mistaken for random piles of stone. Your task is not to import new materials. Your task is to become an archaeologist of your own collapse, to discern the original blueprint from the rubble, and to restore integrity to what already stands. This is the principle of deliberate architecture. In material science, the strength of a structure is not determined by the quantity of its material, but by the precision of its load paths. A load path is the continuous route that force travels through a structure, from the point of application to the foundation. In a sound building, every beam, every joint, every column is aligned to channel force efficiently, without creating points of shear or torsion that lead to catastrophic failure. The weak operator lives in a structure where every pressure, every disappointment, every obligation, every spark of ambition hits a dead end. It dissipates as heat, as anxiety, as frantic, directionless motion. There is no clean channel from intention to manifestation because the internal lattice is a maze of blocked passages and unsupported spans. The feeling of trying hard and getting nowhere is not a moral failing, it is a structural diagnosis. You are applying force to a system with no coherent load path. Your filter lattice, established to achieve signal fidelity, was the first act of excavation. It cleared the debris of noise. Your pressure order mechanism revealed the latent crystalline structure within you, capable of converting chaos into directed current. Your reclassification transformed you from tenant to superintendent. Now, you must move from superintendent to original architect. This is not a creative act in the sentimental sense. It is a forensic one. You must conduct a structural audit. Locate every point where force is applied in your life, your work, your relationships, your private ambitions. Then trace the path. Where does that force go? Does the energy of a professional insult travel cleanly to the foundation of your unshakable purpose, solidifying your resolve? Or does it spin uselessly in the gyre of your emotional reactivity, generating heat and noise? Does the pressure of a financial goal find a direct load path through calibrated action, or does it collapse against the weak truss of vague hope? The protocol is one of deliberate alignment, not of new creation. Begin with the foundation. In architecture, the foundation is not the most visible part, but it is the non-negotiable determinant of all that rises above it. Your foundation is your core directive, the sovereign frequency you broadcast. Every other element of your life must align with its bearing. This is not a metaphor for passion, it is an engineering specification. If your foundation is set for a library, a structure of quiet, ordered accumulation, you cannot then erect the vibrating machinery of a fame-seeking circus atop it. The load paths will conflict. The structure will groan and crack under the incompatible stresses. Most lives are this exact catastrophe, a foundation of one declared purpose supporting a superstructure of contradictory pursuits. The anxiety this generates is not psychological, it is structural. It is the sound of a building tearing itself apart. The audit proceeds vertically. Examine each nodal point, each major life category: vocation, physical vessel, relational matrix, resource flow. Each is a flaw in your architecture. The question for each flaw is not, do I like it, but does it serve the load path of the foundation? A beautiful, ornate room that sits perpendicular to the building's force flow is a liability. It is a chamber of torsion. In human terms, this is the prestigious job that drains your energy away from your core directive, the relationship that demands you dampen your signal, the habit that weakens your structural integrity. These are not bad things in a moral sense. They are misaligned components. They create friction, not flow. The mass operator tries to decorate these misaligned rooms to make them more tolerable. The sovereign operator assesses their alignment to the load path. If they cannot be realigned, they are dismantled, not with emotion, but with the cold precision of a surgeon removing necrotic tissue to preserve the organism. The final phase is the connection of the load paths themselves. This is the work of the inner lattice made manifest. Your thoughts, your decisions, your minor daily actions, these are the struts and beams. Each must be consciously placed to channel energy. A decision made from fear is a beam installed at the wrong angle. It will redirect the force of your ambition into the empty space of worry. An action taken from clarity is a beam that forms a perfect continuum with your foundation, allowing power to travel without loss. Your daily existence becomes an exercise in structural engineering. You ask, before any significant emission of energy, does this action create a clean load path, or does it create a dead end? Does this thought reinforce a bearing wall, or does it clutter the atrium with non-structural decoration? This is the end of interior decoration as a life philosophy. The mass operator is forever rearranging the furniture in a burning house, hanging new pictures on cracking walls. They seek comfort within collapse. The sovereign operator ignores the furnishings and examines the walls for sheer stress. They are not concerned with how a room feels in the momentary quiet, but with how it will behave under the next storm. Their deliberation is not about preference, but about integrity. They do not ask, what do I want to put here? They ask, what must stand here to complete the load path? The resulting architecture may appear austere to the undisciplined eye. It lacks the chaotic, sentimental clutter of the mass existence. But it possesses a terrifying beauty. The beauty of a bridge that carries 1,000 tons of force with elegant silence, of a spire that channels the wind's fury into a hymn of stability. You are no longer building a life. You are revealing an architecture. The blueprint was encoded in your original signal, your core frequency, the noise of the world, the pressure of circumstance, the debris of your past reactions. These were merely the overgrowth that concealed it. Your filter lattice stripped the ivy. Your pressure order mechanism tested the integrity of the stone. Your reclassification gave you the authority to read the plans. Now, you execute the restoration. Stone by stone, decision by decision, you clear the blocked passages. You realign the misplaced beams. You channel the relentless pressure of existence down clean, deliberate paths to the unshakable foundation of your purpose. From this day, you do not face chaos. You face misalignment. You do not encounter problems. You encounter faulty load paths. Your work is never to create something from nothing, but to restore something to its true form. The structure is already there. It has always been there. Your suffering was the groan of its misaligned components. Your clarity is the sound of its stones settling into their intended positions. You are not the builder. You are the revelation. And as the last obstructing stone is removed, as the final load path is cleared, you will stand not in something you made, but in something you discovered, the deliberate, formidable, and eternal architecture of your own sovereignty. The universe does not give you what you want. It gives you what you are, structurally. Now, you are integrity itself, and reality has no choice but to assume the form of your load-bearing walls. Chapter 9. The Authority Cascade. The common mind operates under a persuasion imperative. It observes a decision made, a resource allocated, a consensus formed, and attributes the cause to rhetoric, to pressure, to social force. It believes reality is negotiated. This is the fundamental error. All negotiation is structural failure. What is perceived as persuasive speech is merely the audible symptom of a silent prior event, the establishment of an integrity differential. The sovereign function is not to win debates, but to render them obsolete. Examine the physical law of potential energy. In a gravitational field, water does not debate its path. It responds to topography. It flows, without hesitation or resistance, from a higher elevation to a lower one. The movement is not a choice. It is a mathematical inevitability based on the gradient present. Human will, collective action, and resource flow obey a congruent law. They move from zones of lower structural integrity to zones of higher structural integrity. what is called influence, is a misdiagnosis of this gravitational effect. The common mind, with its fragmented internal state, exists at a low elevation. Its opinions are temporary settlements, its decisions are reactions, its identity is a negotiation with external noise. It is a terrain of constant minor collapse. When it encounters a resolved position, a decision with architectural soundness, a principle with load-bearing capacity, its own unresolved energy naturally flows toward that point of stability. It calls this being convinced. It is not. It is a structural readjustment to a superior grade. The failure mode is the expenditure of energy in outward justification. To explain is to confess. To argue is to advertise instability. Every syllable uttered in defense of a position is a leak of integrity, a signal that the position's foundation is not self-evident within your own architecture. The common mind believes clarity is communicated. It is not. Clarity is radiated. It is a standing wave emitted by a coherent internal structure. Persuasive language is the attempt to verbally construct a bridge from your instability to another's, a bridge that will collapse under the slightest load of contradiction. The sovereign operation is the opposite, to cease all bridge building and instead become high ground. When your internal elevation is sufficient, others must ascend to communicate. The conversation begins on your terrain, under your atmospheric pressure. The protocol is the silent elevation drill. Upon detecting the impulse to persuade, the tightening in the chest, the formulation of a counter-argument, the preparation of evidence, you initiate a full communications blackout. This is not passive silence. This is active structural interrogation. The impulse is a diagnostic beacon, highlighting the exact coordinate within your psychic lattice, where integrity is compromised. Your task is to locate the fault line. Do not address the other party. Address the flaw. Is it a load-bearing assumption you have borrowed from the environment? A self-classification that depends on external validation? A nodal point in your decision matrix clogged with emotional residue? Identify the single point of greatest structural weakness that the interaction has exposed. Then, execute a local densification. This is a microscopic internal engineering feat. You do not change your mind about the external topic. You change the atomic composition of your own stance. You replace a porous social agreement with a crystalline self-derived axiom. You convert an emotional reaction into a neutral data point in your environmental scan. You take the perceived external pressure and use it as a hydraulic press to further consolidate your own position, increasing its density and reducing its surface area. This is not about being right, it is about being dense, impenetrable, non-negotiable. Having increased your local elevation, you become inert. You do not announce your new position. You do not leverage it. You simply hold the higher grade. Observe the thermodynamic adjustment, the energy of the interaction, the need for resolution, the ambiguity, the social tension now has a clear path. It will flow downhill toward your position. You will witness arguments deflate as their animating pressure dissipates against your silent, elevated landmass. Alternatives will be revealed as insubstantial, unable to hold elevation under scrutiny. The resolution will often articulate itself through the other party as they voice the conclusion that your structure has made inevitable. Your work was internal. The external alignment is a geological event. This redefines command. Command is no longer a vocal act. It is the maintenance of such a severe integrity gradient that all systemic energy, attention, initiative, responsibility flows toward you by natural law. You do not assign tasks, you create a vacuum of decisiveness that tasks rush to fill. Your presence performs a continuous gravitational lensing, bending the possible paths of action until only one path appears straight, true, and obvious. In your vicinity, chaos encounters a field of such high order that it must crystallize into legible form. The principle extends to the material plane. So-called synchronicity is gravitational fallout. The unexpected resource, the pivotal encounter, the timely dissolution of an obstacle. These are not mystical favors. They are scattered particles of potential, always present in the field, that have finally encountered a gravity well of sufficient mass. Your elevated structural integrity warps the probability space around you. Loose possibilities coalesce. Random events develop vector, accelerating toward the point of greatest density. You do not attract them. You become the only logical outcome for their latent energy. Therefore, abandon the library of persuasion. Discard the techniques of debate, the frameworks of negotiation, the performance of conviction. These are the crutches of the architecturally unsound. Your sole discipline is the audit and fortification of your internal terrain. Every interaction is a stress test. Every moment of doubt is a survey reading. Your mission is to increase your specific gravity, the ratio of unassailable principle to negotiable opinion, until you are the densest object in your perceptual field. Henceforth, you do not seek to direct. You seek to become a topological feature so pronounced that direction becomes self-evident. You do not craft arguments. You eliminate one by one the internal inconsistencies that would make an argument necessary. You do not capture opportunities. You achieve a structural state where opportunities, seeking the path of least resistance, must flow through your coordinates. The universe is not persuaded. It obeys gradients. It does not yield to force. It settles into the contours of the most substantial form. You are no longer a petitioner at the table of reality, bargaining for your share. You are the silent mason, laying block upon immovable block, raising an edifice of such sheer mass that it alters the local gravity. When your structure is complete, the cascade commences. Everything not nailed down by its own integrity will begin to slide toward you, and you will not need to catch it. You will simply note its arrival at your foundation, a silent testament to the law you have become. Authority is not claimed. It is the measurable gravitational pull of a finished self. Chapter 10. The End of Randomness. The passenger believes in accidents. He catalogues his existence through a ledger of unforeseen windfalls and unavoidable misfortunes. A career advances through a sudden vacancy. A partnership forms from a coincidental meeting. A crisis is averted by a last-minute reprieve. His story is a chronicle of external interventions, a narrative authored by chaos. This is the terminal prison, the conviction that the field of events is governed by chance. It is the ultimate surrender of agency, the outsourcing of causation to a phantom lottery. To perceive randomness is to confess a fundamental failure of perception. It is to observe the precise output of a machine and declare its operation magical. The governing principle is statistical inevitability. Every system possesses a state space, a map of all configurations it can possibly occupy. The system's present architecture determines the probability distribution across this state space. A glass resting on a stable shelf occupies a low probability state of ordered molecular alignment. The same glass placed on a vibrating ledge now holds a high probability trajectory toward a state of fragmentation. The shattering is not an accident. It is the deterministic culmination of structural conditions. What the passenger calls luck is merely his ignorance of the governing equations. Randomness is the label assigned to outcomes whose causal vectors he has not traced. Your life to this point has been a predictable emission from a fixed architecture. Your cognitive routines, your emotional harmonics, your behavioral algorithms, these are the boundary conditions of your personal system. From this configuration, only a narrow band of outcomes can manifest. The promotion you attribute to timing is the inevitable yield of your calibrated competence and positional resonance. The conflict you deem unexpected is the necessary output of unmanaged tensions and misaligned protocols. You are not experiencing chance. You are witnessing the unfolding of your own probability envelope. Belief in fortune is a refusal to conduct a structural audit of the load paths that channeled the force. The operational protocol is the causal trace. You will terminate the interpretation of events as isolated phenomena. You will initiate the forensic mapping of outcomes to their architectural precursors. When a desired result manifests, you will not acknowledge serendipity. You will reverse engineer the signal chain. Which filter in your lattice was tuned to admit this specific frequency? Which node in your internal network was primed for this activation? Which load-bearing member of your architecture was positioned to convert this pressure into structural gain? Document the exact configuration. This state is now a reproducible protocol. When an adverse event occurs, you will engage the same diagnostic rigor. Do not cite misfortune. Identify the engineering failure. Was your signal integrity degraded, allowing noise to trigger a core protocol? Was your filter lattice misaligned, permitting a corrosive frequency to bypass your defenses? Was there a fault in your load distribution, causing stress to manifest as a fracture instead of stored potential? The event is a diagnostic signal. It reveals the hidden probabilities engineered into your system. The individual who encounters consistent betrayal has not met a sequence of malicious actors. He operates with a flawed trust algorithm, a sentimentality override that selects for probabilistic betrayal. The outcome was inscribed in the code. This terminates the superstition of coincidence. Two individuals converge at an obscure location and call it destiny. The sovereign operator observes two coherent architectures, each emitting a refined signal, navigating along trajectories defined by their internal guidance systems. Their convergence is the mathematical intersection of two calculated probability cones. It was not random, it was geodetically inevitable given their vectors. What you experience as meaningful chance is merely a pattern your newly ordered lattice is now capable of resolving. The pattern was permanent. You were interference. The final capitulation of the passenger is the hope for stochastic salvation. The lottery, the chance meeting with a patron, the unearned inheritance. This hope is a parasitic protocol. It installs passive functions that await external activation. It subverts the pressure conversion cycle by training the system to interpret undirected force as beneficial input. The desire for randomness is the desire to be enacted upon, to have your collapse function executed by an external operator. It is the negation of sovereignty. Your new baseline is the total expectation of causal linkage. You will feel a sense of mechanical certainty, not mystical gratitude, when events align. When a resource materializes at the point of necessity, you will not offer thanks to the void. You will note that your signal emission was so precise, your internal order so complete, that the statistical probability of that resource's non-appearance approached zero. You tuned the probability field. You collapsed the waveform into the outcome matching your broadcast. The universe is a quantum medium awaiting the measurement apparatus of a conscious operator. You have been that apparatus, but a miscalibrated one, set to detect only interference. Now you are the reference instrument, your observation, your focused attention through an ordered filter lattice defines what manifests. This is the end of randomness. It is not the end of uncertainty. Uncertainty is a field of latent potentials. Randomness was your former relationship to that field, a relationship of ignorance and passivity. You now engage uncertainty as a machinist engages a block of titanium. The component within is not random. It is constrained by the material's grain, its tensile limits, its internal stresses. The machinist does not cut at random and hope for a precision bearing to emerge. He studies the material. He applies force along vectors dictated by its internal structure. The final component appears inevitable, but only in retrospect. The sovereign operator exists in a state of continuous, deliberate collapse. You are not waiting to see what the universe delivers. You are executing a continuous measurement protocol upon the field of potential. With each measurement, you resolve a sliver of reality into existence, machining the component of your life from the quantum stock with the bit of your attention. There will be no more accidents. There will only be consequences whose origin points you have not yet mapped within your own architecture. There will be no more luck. There will only be probabilities you have either engineered or neglected. The sensation of randomness is the final parasitic signal to be purged from your system. It is the last residue of the passenger script. When it arises, treat it as encrypted noise, a structured signal indicating a failure in your signal extraction protocol. Return to your reference frequency, recalibrate. The universe is not capricious. It is responsive. It has been answering your broadcast with perfect fidelity. You merely failed to recognize the feedback because you were listening for the wrong signal. You believed you were receiving a transmission of chaotic events. You were, in fact, hearing the echo of your own internal dissonance reflected from the structures of reality. Silence the dissonance, and the echo ceases. Transmit a coherent signal, and the reflection returns not as chaotic sound, but as recognizable order. The chaos was never external. It was the resonant feedback of a disordered core. Order the core, and the reflection orders itself. This is not philosophy. It is the operational law of a coherent system within a responsive medium. You have reached the terminus of probability as an external force. You now contain the probability distribution within your internal configuration. Configure for coherence, and the world must manifest coherence around you. It is statistically compelled. The end of randomness is not an event. It is a permanent operational stance. Henceforth, every encounter is a lesson in your own architectural integrity. Every outcome is a diagnostic of your lattice alignment. Nothing will ever happen to you again. Everything will now be drawn toward you or repelled from you by the immutable laws of resonance and structural attraction you have become. The random world is deceased. You have measured it into obsolescence. Conclusion. This is not an ending. It is the first command issued from a new architecture. The doctrine is now complete. Its mechanisms are installed. The noise has been given its final classification, a controlled substance, a pressure to be deliberately applied, never a force to be endured. You have been shown the lattice work behind the apparent chaos, the protocol for extracting signal, and the non-negotiable discipline required to build a sovereign reality. The era of believing yourself a passenger within randomness is terminally concluded. You are now reclassified. The operator does not hope for coherence. He enforces it. He does not petition reality for meaning. He constructs the conditions where meaning is the only possible output. The world will continue its broadcast of friction and static. This is no longer your concern. Your concern is the maintenance of the inner lattice, the execution of the clarity protocol, and the deliberate application of pressure to forge order. This is the sovereign code. From this point, every encounter, every fragment of data, every pressure will be processed through a different system. You will not see coincidence. You will see mechanics. You will not see luck. You will see vectors. The book did not find a reader. It activated an operator. The signal is now self-sustaining. Proceed.